For years, one of the most persuasive arguments for Linux lived in a single sentence. Your old computer is too slow for Windows? Put Linux on it. It was elegant. It was true. Distributions like Ubuntu could breathe life into hardware that Windows had outgrown. The operating system that ran government's servers, the world's stock exchanges, and nearly every Android phone in existence was also the thing you installed on a 2009 laptop to keep it useful. Light, flexible, free? Then, in April 2026, Canonical published the official system requirements for Ubuntu Desktop 26 or 04 LTS. Minimum RAM, 6 GB. Windows 11's official minimum, 4 GB. On paper, one of the most famous Linux distributions now asks for more memory than Microsoft's operating system that people have been fleeing to Linux to escape. How did that happen? The number is not a rumor. It's not a misreading of unofficial documentation. Canonical's own release notes for Ubuntu 26.04 LTS, published on its official documentation site, are explicit. Ubuntu Desktop 26.04 LTS requires a 2 GHz dual-core processor or better, a minimum of 6 GB RAM, and 25 GB of free storage space for a comfortable experience. That 6 GB figure is the first increase in Ubuntu's desktop RAM requirement since 2018, when Ubuntu 18.04 bumped the baseline to 2 GB, later revised to 4 GB in 2019 following community feedback. The 4 GB requirement then held for 7 years across Ubuntu 20.04, 22.04, 24.04, and a series of interim releases. It survived 2 LTS cycles. It survived Wayland becoming the default. It survived major GNOME overhauls. And then, with 26.04, it jumped 50% to 6 GB. Ubuntu 26.04 LTS launched on April 23, 2026, with 5 years of standard support and an additional 5 years of expanded maintenance through Ubuntu Pro. This is not a minor release. It is a long-term support release, the kind that organizations and individuals deploy and depend on for years at a time. When Canonical sets a requirement in an LTS release, it is setting a statement about what the modern Ubuntu desktop is. And that statement now sits above what Microsoft officially requires for Windows 11. Before the comparison runs away with itself, a more precise question has to be asked. What does Linux actually require? The answer is, it depends entirely on which Linux. Linux is a kernel. It is the core of an operating system, not the operating system itself. On top of that kernel, hundreds of distributions have been built, each making different decisions about which desktop environment to include, which services to run by default, which applications come pre-installed, and how much of the system's resources the baseline configuration consumes. Ubuntu is one of those distributions, and it is a prominent one, but it is not Linux. Fedora Workstation lists 2 GB of RAM as its minimum. Debian lists 2 GB. Linux Mint, which is partly derived from Ubuntu, lists 2 GB. Pop! OS lists 4 GB. These are all current mainstream Linux distributions. Ubuntu 26.04's 6 GB requirement sits above all of them. And Canonical itself acknowledges the ecosystem beneath Ubuntu Desktop. The official release notes state that systems with lower specifications can use Ubuntu flavors instead, specifically naming Ubuntu and Lubuntu as options for machines with 2 GB of RAM or more. These are lightweight variants of Ubuntu that use different desktop environments designed to consume substantially fewer resources. So the accurate headline is narrower than the dramatic one. Ubuntu Desktop 26.04 now requires more RAM than Windows 11 officially does. Linux, taken as a whole, has not suddenly become heavier than Windows. The Ubuntu Desktop variant, the one with GNOME, with full integration services, with modern graphical features, has raised its floor. That distinction matters. But it still leaves an interesting question unanswered. Ubuntu's RAM requirement hadn't changed in 7 years. The desktop environment had evolved. The kernel had advanced through multiple major versions. The default display protocol had shifted from X11 to Wayland. Applications had grown. And through all of it, the official minimum stayed at 4 GB. Then it jumped. The most honest explanation available from technical reporting is not a single cause, but a convergence. TechPowerUp, in its coverage of the announcement, wrote directly, "The change is not caused by a heavier core OS. It reflects the reality of modern workloads." That framing is important because it avoids the easy narrative. This is not a story about Ubuntu becoming bloated. The individual components of the Ubuntu 26.04 stack have not uniformly gotten heavier. GNOME 50, which ships with this release, actually documented memory usage reductions in its file manager. The kernel does not idle at 2 GB. The display server is not the culprit. What changed is what people do with computers. A modern Ubuntu desktop session is not the system idling. It is the system running a browser, usually with multiple tabs. Those tabs are running Gmail, which is not a simple web page, but a full email application that indexes and renders your inbox continuously. They are running Google Docs, which is a word processor living in the browser. They are running YouTube, which is decoding video. They may be running Slack or Teams or Discord, applications that are at their core another Chromium browser wrapped in an application shell, each consuming memory independently. This is the elephant that had been sitting quietly in Ubuntu's requirements for years. Modern computing is not primarily about what the operating system consumes at idle. It is about what the operating system is expected to run comfortably, and the answer to that changed dramatically over the 7 years that Ubuntu's RAM requirement didn't. The Windows 11 comparison deserves direct examination, because the 4 GB versus 6 GB gap can be read in two different ways depending on what you emphasize. Reading one, Windows 11 is more efficient, more accessible to low-end hardware, and Ubuntu has gotten heavier than its primary competitor. Reading two, the two numbers are measuring different things, and putting them side by side as if their equivalent understates what both operating systems actually require to perform well. Microsoft's official Windows 11 requirements include a compatible 64-bit processor from a specific list of approved CPUs, a TPM 2.0 security chip, secure boot capability, 64 GB of storage, and DirectX 12 compatible graphics, in addition to the 4 GB RAM minimum. The 4 GB figure is the RAM threshold for installation and upgrade eligibility, not a guarantee that 4 GB produces a pleasant experience. A machine that meets every Windows 11 minimum specification and actually has exactly 4 GB of RAM will run Windows 11 technically. Running Chrome with 5 tabs, a PDF, and a Slack conversation on that machine is a different story. Ubuntu's 6 GB figure comes with its own framing. Canonical's release notes specify that 6 GB is the minimum for a comfortable experience, not a hard installation gate. Independent testing by OMG Ubuntu ran Ubuntu 26.04's beta on a machine with 2 GB of RAM. It installed. It booted. The reviewer described it as slow to the point of frustration, but otherwise functional. Ubuntu did not refuse to run. It ran poorly. This is where the comparison between the two requirements becomes philosophically interesting. Microsoft's 4 GB figure is an enforced gate. Below this, you cannot install. Canonical's 6 GB figure is an honest declaration. Below this, you won't be comfortable. These are different claims about the relationship between a number and an experience. The more truthful version of the comparison is both Windows 11 and Ubuntu 26.04 need considerably more than their stated minimums to handle a modern workload comfortably. The minimums are not benchmarks. They are floors, and the floors are different in kind, not just in height. Now ask the harder question. Given that the 4 GB requirement held for 7 years, why did Canonical change it now? Canonical hasn't published a detailed engineering breakdown of what specifically pushed the number from 4 GB to 6 GB. What reporting and technical sources do establish is that the pressure came from the direction of usage rather than from any dramatic change to Ubuntu's core components. The modern Ubuntu Desktop session involves a full GNOME environment with session management, compositor, search indexing, accessibility services, and hardware integration. Running on top of that is a browser, almost certainly a Chromium-based one, which is itself an increasingly complex piece of software. Chrome and its derivatives use process isolation extensively, meaning each browser tab can be its own operating system process, each with its own memory allocation. Opening 10 tabs in a modern browser on a lightweight OS is not the same as opening 10 tabs was in 2018. Layered on top of that, web applications have grown to behave like native applications, but they carry none of the memory efficiency optimizations that native applications implement. Gmail processes email in the browser, Figma renders design files, YouTube decodes video. Each of these is running inside a JavaScript engine, inside a browser process, inside an operating system that is simultaneously managing graphics, network, storage, and background services. The result is that the operating system itself might consume a manageable 800 ml to 1.5 GB at idle, but the practical computing environment that a user expects Ubuntu Desktop to support might demand 4 GB before the user has opened anything they'd call an application. The official minimum crossed from 4 GB to 6 GB because the honest baseline for a comfortable working session crossed it in real life, and a requirement that no longer reflects reality stops being useful. One source described the change as an honesty bump. That framing is probably right. The requirement didn't change because Ubuntu became heavier. It changed because Ubuntu's developers acknowledged what it had been like to use Ubuntu Desktop for real work on 4 GB for several years. The story of Ubuntu's requirement history is actually a slow escalation across multiple decades. Ubuntu 12.04, released in 2012, required 384 MWR of RAM for 32-bit systems. That number reflects a different era entirely, when browsers were lighter, when web applications didn't exist as a category, when a computer's primary workload might be a word processor and an email client. Ubuntu 14.04 raised the minimum to 1 GB. Ubuntu 18.04 raised it to 2 GB, then revised to 4 GB in 2019, now 6 GB. Each of those increases tracks something real. They track the growing complexity of what a desktop operating system is expected to do. The desktop environment gained features. The browser gained complexity. The web gained weight. The applications people consider standard, video calls, collaborative documents, real-time communication tools, all consume more than their predecessors did. Windows has followed the same trajectory, just with different numbers and enforced in different ways. Windows XP ran on 128 MB. Windows 7 required 1 GB. Windows 10 required 2 GB. Windows 11 requires 4 GB with its full set of additional constraints. The movement is in the same direction. The question is whether the stated minimum honestly reflects what the system needs to work well. And increasingly, the honest answer for any modern operating system running a modern workload is more than the minimum. The one dimension of this story that consistently gets lost in the RAM comparison is what Linux's flexibility actually means in practice. Ubuntu Desktop 26.04 asks for 6 GB, but Ubuntu Desktop is one choice among many in a Linux ecosystem that offers specifically designed lightweight alternatives. Ubuntu uses the XFCE desktop environment, which prioritizes efficiency over visual richness and runs comfortably on substantially less memory. Ubuntu uses LXQT, an even lighter environment designed specifically for machines with limited resources. Both are official Ubuntu flavors. They use the same Ubuntu base, receive the same security updates, and are explicitly recommended by Canonical for machines that fall below Ubuntu Desktop's new floor. Beyond those, the broader Linux ecosystem includes distributions like Anti-X, which targets machines with as little as 256 MB of RAM. Tiny Core Linux runs in under 50 MB. These are not mainstream options for someone who wants a full-featured desktop experience, but they demonstrate something important about the nature of Linux as a platform. The same kernel that Ubuntu Desktop uses for modern hardware can be configured to run on almost nothing. Windows doesn't offer this kind of range under a single vendor's umbrella. If a machine doesn't meet Windows 11's requirements, the options are run Windows 10 until October 2027's extended support deadline, accept an unsupported installation, or move to a different operating system entirely. Windows 11 doesn't have a lightweight variant that Microsoft ships for older hardware. Ubuntu's 6 GB requirement is therefore not a ceiling that excludes old hardware from Linux. It's a specification for one experience tier in an ecosystem with multiple tiers. Windows has one tier. Linux has many. So what should someone with a 4 GB machine actually do with this information? Nothing dramatic. The Ubuntu 26.04 requirement doesn't mean 4 GB computers have been locked out of Linux. They've been redirected toward better suited options within the same ecosystem. A machine with 4 GB of RAM is exactly the hardware that Ubuntu or Lubuntu is designed for. The user gets Ubuntu's security infrastructure, Ubuntu's update schedule, Ubuntu's community support, just with a desktop environment that was designed to use less of the system's resources. The trade-off is visual polish and some integrated features that GNOME provides. The gain is a computer that actually works well on the hardware it has. A machine with 6 GB or more should have no concerns. Ubuntu Desktop 26.04 meets Canonical's stated floor. Real-world performance will still depend on workload. A machine with exactly 6 GB running browser heavy work will feel the pressure, but the system is in the range Canonical designed for. A machine with 8 GB or more is in comfortable territory for Ubuntu Desktop with a typical modern workload. Whether it's Ubuntu, Windows 11, or anything else, 8 GB is the practical baseline that most modern computing scenarios actually need rather than technically survive. The final question this story raises is bigger than RAM requirements. Ubuntu's 6 GB announcement generated the reaction it did because it disrupted a simple mental model. Linux is lightweight, Windows is heavy, old computers go to Linux. That model was always a simplification, but it was a useful one for a long time. What Ubuntu 26.04 makes explicit is that the simplification has expired. The operating system is no longer the primary determinant of how much memory your computer needs. The workload is. A modern browser running modern web applications will consume significant resources on any operating system. Linux, Windows, Mac OS, the operating system's overhead is increasingly a smaller fraction of the total. This is actually an argument for Linux, not against it. If the operating system's own footprint matters less than the workload's footprint, then Linux's advantage and efficient system processes can be applied where it still matters. Server environments, embedded systems, minimal installations, specialized use cases. Ubuntu Desktop's decision to be honest about what its intended workload requires doesn't diminish that advantage. It clarifies which part of the Linux ecosystem has which advantage. Return to the opening sentence. Your old computer is too slow for Windows. Put Linux on it. That sentence is still true. It's just more specific now. If your old computer has 2 GB of RAM and is genuinely too slow for Windows, the answer in 2026 is Ubuntu or Lubuntu. or one of the lightweight distributions that the Linux ecosystem exists precisely to provide. Not Ubuntu Desktop 26.04, which has honestly said it wasn't designed for that. Ubuntu Desktop 26.04 is designed for a modern computing workload: the browser, the web applications, the video calls, the collaborative tools, the real-time services, on hardware that can actually handle that workload comfortably. Raising the requirement from 4 GB to 6 GB is the acknowledgement that those workloads changed while the requirement didn't, and that pretending otherwise isn't doing anyone a favor. So maybe the surprising part isn't that Ubuntu now needs 6 GB of RAM. Maybe the surprising part is that we're still comparing operating systems by the minimum amount of memory they can technically boot with. Because in 2026, the real question isn't whether Linux can run on this old PC. It's which Linux can, and what kind of experience do you actually want?